attacks straight away. We discovered, and with increasing amazement and increasing horror, that in fact this was the first act of terrorism that had ever been conducted by a foreign state on New Zealand soil. It's the only act of terrorism that has ever been conducted by another state on New Zealand soil. Obviously not of the magnitude of the horrific attacks that you suffered on the 11th of September last year, but nevertheless for us it was a rather rude awakening call, and the fact that someone had been killed made it that much worse. Again, in terms of numbers, they pale. One person pales in comparison with the losses you had. But for us, it was very much a defining event, and in the same sort of way that the terrible attacks on the World Trade Center were. We found, when we investigated, that there were a group of French operatives, French Secret Service operatives, who'd arrived by yacht in New Zealand. And they, immediately after the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior, they sailed out of New Zealand. They sailed initially to Australia. At this stage, our police authorities suspected that they had something to do with the bombing but couldn't prove it. We asked the Australians to hold the yacht. They could only do this for a certain amount of time. The yacht then sailed north and disappeared. And it's widely believed that in fact it was scuttled, and that the 5 people on board were picked up by a French military submarine and spirited away, and that was the last that was seen of them. Now that was one part of the team. There was also another part of the team, a man and a woman who came into New Zealand posing as Swiss tourists on Swiss passports. And they, consistent with the illusion that they were trying to promote of being tourists, they didn't leave immediately after the Rainbow Warrior sinking. They hired a camper van. I think you call them camper vans in the United States, do you? Yeah, camper van. And they went on a tour through the North Island of New Zealand and then down through the South Island. Now, our authorities pretty quickly associated them with the attack on the Rainbow Warrior. It wasn't clear to them how many passports these people had and whether they were still in the country. But it transpired that they actually were, because when they'd finished on their scenic tour down through the North Island, through the South Island, back up to the North Island, back to Auckland where they'd hired the camper van, they took it back to the company from which they'd hired it, and they asked for their deposit back. Now, the New Zealand Police, as I say, had already associated them with the bombing at this stage. The rather smart clerk at the camper van hire agency said that their cheque printing computer was causing some problems, and would they mind just going and sitting over there for 5 or 10 minutes while they got the cheque printed. And of course 5 or 10 minutes later it wasn't the cheque that arrived, it was the New Zealand Police, and these 2 people who subsequently turned out to be Major Marfar and Captain Prieur of the French Secret Service were arrested. They subsequently pleaded guilty to blowing up to a terrorist act against a vessel and also to homicide. And they were sentenced to 10 years in prison amidst, as I say, a huge amount of outrage in New Zealand that such an action would ever be committed against us, a peaceful country, and certainly an action that was committed by another peaceful, democratic, friendly country. This wasn't the sort of action that we expected. The 2 people, Major Marfar and Captain Prieur, were then sent to prison, but the French authorities were not prepared to let go. They wanted their 2 people back. And this was, not only was this a cause of outrage in New Zealand, it was a huge public scandal in France. People in France were also outraged that their government would get involved in such a thing. This had been sanctioned from the Minister of Defence all the way down through French channels. There was suspicion that it may even have gone higher than the Minister of Defence, but that was never established. The Minister of Defence actually resigned over this, and so did a number of other leading French officials. And they wanted their people back, because as long as their people were sitting languishing in a New Zealand prison for 10 years, then this was going to be an ongoing political problem in France. So, as a large country, a member of the European Union, major trading power, they began to exert pressure on New Zealand. We found that we had increasing difficulty getting our produce, which we're totally dependent on economically, into the European Union. New Zealand wool bales were being ripped open by the French authorities and were being searched for heroin. Now, we have a little bit of heroin may come into New Zealand. It's very little. We certainly aren't a source of heroin. We aren't a source of drugs. And this was completely ludicrous. But this was all designed to interfere with our trade. And so it became very apparent to the New Zealand government too that something needed to be done to resolve this. And so the issue was referred to the Secretary-General of the United Nations to resolve by way of mediation between our two countries. And the end result of that was that the Secretary-General issued a ruling that gave New Zealand $7.5 million financial compensation for the costs that we'd suffered, the expense that we'd been put to. And the two agents, Major Maffa and Captain Prieur, were ordered to be transferred to a small military base in the South Pacific, a place called Howe Atoll, also over in French Polynesia, and they were to stay there for 3 years and serve out a 3-year term there, after which they would go back to France and the issue would be totally over between the two countries. Unfortunately, neither Major Maffa nor Captain Prieur actually stayed on Howe Atoll for 3 years. Major Maffa was removed after less than 17 months, ostensibly on medical grounds. And then 3 days before the French presidential elections, Captain Prieur was removed from Howe Atoll on the grounds that she was 6 weeks pregnant and her father, who she hadn't seen, she was estranged from, was dying. And she'd spent just over 21 months on Howe Atoll. She was greeted on the tarmac by the President of France amidst publicity and media, and you can see exactly why this was done. So we protested that and asked for the two to be returned back to Howe Atoll. That didn't happen, and so we again went to arbitration, this time here in New York, under the terms of the Secretary-General's ruling, and France was held to have acted unlawfully in removing the two saboteurs from Howe Atoll within the 3-year period. Again, this was a considerable embarrassment to the French authorities and didn't entirely assuage the feelings in New Zealand, but it resolved the matter. Subsequently, France continued testing, but subsequently there was agreement in 1995 that amongst all of the nuclear weapon states, there was a deal done where the non-nuclear weapon states parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty were agreed to indefinitely extend the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, the deal, which you may or may not be familiar with, under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, was that there were a certain number of states, there were 5 nuclear weapons declared states who had nuclear weapons, and they agreed to move towards nuclear disarmament. On the other hand, the rest of the world that didn't have nuclear weapons, with a couple of exceptions, agreed that they would not acquire nuclear weapons. So the deal was, if you didn't have them, you weren't going to get them, and if you did have them, you were gradually going to reduce your holding, and ultimately you would reach a point of nuclear disarmament. Now, President Kennedy estimated when he was in office before this deal that at the turn of this century there would be at least 25 nuclear-armed states in the world. In fact, because of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty,